Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Bob Ingracia, and we're still seeing the numbers of participants moving up. So I'm going to just pause here just for a few more seconds, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Again, my name is Bob Ingracia. I'm Vice President of External Relations at Minnesota Children's Museum. I'm going to quickly go through some quick housekeeping items before I introduce Erin, and then we'll jump right in. So today, let's go ahead and use the chat or the Q&A. If you've got questions or comments, we're going to have some Q&A at the end. But if you've got questions while Erin is presenting, hop in there with the chat, and I'll try to get those questions to her, and she'll either answer during the presentation or during the Q&A at the end. Stay on mute. That's the plan today, is to use the chat or the Q&A. And we're not going to really be looking at the raise hand feature. So let's skip using raise hand. We are recording, possibly for later rebroadcast. And so I also want to quickly thank the University of Minnesota, which was kind enough to grant the Children's Museum access to their very robust Zoom account. So that was very nice of the U of M. And just a quick plug too, if this is a free event, if you'd like to make a donation to the Children's Museum to help cover some of our costs, that would be great. There'll be a link in the confirmation or in the email that follows up from the webinar. And without further ado, I really want to talk about how excited we are at the museum to partner with Erin Walsh today for this first of 3 webinars about parenting during this really difficult pandemic. So Erin, well, today's topic, of course, is managing all this screen time that has really become just so prevalent with during the pandemic, with not being able to go out as much, with so much distance learning. And so it's a really very timely topic. I think the pandemic stretched a lot longer than maybe a lot of us thought. And so it's a really great time to kind of get re-energized and think more about, as we sort of get to the finish line, how we can manage and cope and think about screen time with our kids. So I don't know if many of you know Erin or not, but she has built a great reputation over 20 years in early childhood development, in parenting, and really helping parents raise great kids. She has also got a great specialty in helping sort through all the information about screen time, technology, and kids. A lot of it conflicting information. Erin has spent so much time and energy on helping sort through and helping us think about how to process all this information and incorporate some of the key things into our own lives. So for nearly 20 years, she's worked alongside her father, Dr. David Walsh, also a very well-known national expert in parenting and early childhood and teen adolescent development. In 2018, she and her father and her mother co-founded Spark and Stitch Institute, which is and she can talk more about that too, but it's an entity devoted to helping parents and the broader community raise great kids. And so without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Erin. Really exciting. And thank you, Erin, again for joining us, and really look forward to hearing all you have to share today.
Thanks so much, Bob, for the great introduction and the warm welcome. While I wish we were together at the museum itself, I'm really grateful still that that Minnesota Children's Museum is getting creative and thinking about ways to support families and to support kids during what is abundantly clear is a marathon, not a sprint, and is requiring all of us to get more and more creative, creative with how we're connecting, creative with how we're learning, and certainly creative with how we're parenting. So at Spark and Stitch Institute, we use brain science to spark understanding and then stitch that science together with practical strategies. Because in my work, I don't just wear the research hat, though I spend a lot of my time reading research and trying to translate it into more easy to understand language for educators and parents and kids themselves. But I'm also here wearing my parenting hat. And I think it's so important that we always sort of stitch together the research and the practice, because parenting has always been messy and complicated. And I think parenting during a pandemic even more so. And so if you are anything like me, your world has changed quite dramatically. And we have gotten creative. And I think we all greet this time with a lot of, in the words of little kids, as we think about our young kids, a lot of big feelings. I spent last year transitioning my kindergartner from face-to-face school to virtual kindergarten. And I had a lot of mixed emotions about that, right? I think I actually wept openly the first time that my youngest kid's kindergarten teacher, they went live, and it was clear that she had watched a lot of Mr. Rogers episodes in preparation for the lesson that day. Because as the kids logged on, she was like, "Oh, hello, children," and like sorted laundry with them, as they interacted. And I cried. I was inspired. I was moved. I think I also cried when, after that lesson, I asked my youngest, how was school today? And he said it was good, but not as good as a hug. And those are the kinds of little gems or kernels of truth that I think we're all feeling right now. So we are going to spend the next hour talking about handling screen time. And what I hope to do is to translate some of the research in more clear guideposts for us as we make a complicated set of choices. But I first want to acknowledge that, I shared a quick story, but I'm not the only one with complicated feelings about screen time. So this is likely maybe not your first Zoom meeting of the day. Maybe you stumbled here meeting after meeting. So you're in the right place. If you are here because you feel profoundly grateful for screens and what they've allowed you and your family and your kids to be able to do during this really challenging time. You're also in the right place if you feel profoundly resentful of screens right now, of their limitations. They're not the same as a hug. And you're also in the right place. In any parenting workshop, we're going to be doing 3 of these virtual events in partnership with Minnesota Children's Museum. But every time, whether I'm in a room or a virtual room with parents and caregivers and parenting adults, we want to strike that tender balance, especially during times of stress and strain. That you're probably here because you want, deserve, and need some affirmation that we are all doing the very best we can with what we have. And you want to turn towards each other and to hear from the field, the research, that you are doing a great job. And I hope that you leave today with that affirmation. You're probably also here because you want some advice and some problem solving. And that combination of whether you're looking for affirmation or advice can change minute to minute during the pandemic. It can change depending upon the day, whether we have the sort of room and the bandwidth to be in problem solving mode. So I hope to be able to provide both of those elements for you during our short time together. So why don't you go ahead? Bob mentioned that we are going to be using the chat, and I really do hope that no matter what's going on in the room, you have the freedom of being on mute and cameras off, but I hope you have your fingers available. And if you could go find the chat right now and just let me know which one of these statements resonates with you most today. And you're welcome to say all 3, or, grateful and resentful. Why don't you go over there to the chat and let me know which one of these resonates today. Don't worry, I'm not going to hold you to it. You're not signing on the dotted line. This is just an opportunity for us to share a little bit with each other. So I'll read some of this out. You have the opportunity to share just with the panelists or with everyone. I see a lot of folks are sharing just with the panelists, so I'll I'll read some of these out. I see a lot of people in all caps saying all three, minute to minute. I definitely want advice, but please tell me I'm doing okay, grateful and resentful. So this is useful for us to normalize that we all, approach this moment with a lot of mixed feelings. And I love that they're just pouring in, right? So I want them all, affirmation and advice. I feel all three. So as we approach this, we have mixed emotions internally, and then we have a lot of mixed research about screen time and young children. And so this is an important time to ground our conversation together in our guiding philosophy at Spark and Stitch Institute. It's not a new philosophy. I got into this work with my dad, Dr. Dave Walsh, as Bob mentioned in the introduction. He actually started doing this work in the 90s, and this was his sort of a founding philosophy of looking at media's impact on children's health and development. I gotta say though, that when he started his work, I was a teenager at the time. So I was not on board necessarily. Never thought I'd be presenting this slide, a couple decades later. Not because I didn't agree with his philosophy, but I just didn't think that media and screens were that big of a deal. So as any good recovering teenager does, I went back to him, early in my career and said, turns out you were onto something. And that guiding philosophy from when researchers first started looking at the powerful role of screens and technology in young children's development, that power has only intensified and increased. And so we are not going to decide definitively over the lunch hour here with Minnesota Children's Museum whether technology is good or bad for kids. Instead, what we want to do is unpack the power, because the research is really clear that digital technologies are not inherently good or bad, they are powerful. The good or bad depends upon how we use them, the role that they play in our families, at what age, how they shape our interactions, and our specific kids. And so this is going to guide our conversation. And it's useful, I think, to ground the conversation here, because if we were to start the conversation with, is tech good or bad? It not only isn't backed up by the evidence, but it tends to shape our parenting response in ways that aren't always useful. Once we decide all screen time is bad, it's really easy to fall into unrealistic expectations and to just pile on screen time shame. During a time of stress, the last thing we need right now as sort of the other essential workers on the front lines of the pandemic, which are parents and caregivers, the last thing we need to do is add on another layer of stress called screen time shame, right? So we tend to, if we are looking at these extremes, as parents then, we tend to vacillate between those two extremes. So we either walk around the house in a fit of frustration, unplugging devices as we go, muttering how they're ruining our brains, and vowing, right, that we will only be using, non-screen-based tools from here forward. So this is the sort of screens are a toxic substance that must be avoided. On the other hand, this doesn't tend to last very long. And so, especially during a pandemic, it's not super useful. And so when we get exhausted and overwhelmed, we sort of swing to the other direction. We say, you know what, here's an iPad. We'll see you in 2021. I'm juggling so much right now. This is an impossible set of choices. And so let me know, again, this might mirror your response to my first question, but let me know if you tend to, in times of stress, swing towards the red, just sort of no screens, walking around unplugging devices, or whether you tend towards the green, or as Brooke just shared, whether you're swinging wildly between them, maybe hour to hour or day to day. And so we have a lot of folks who are engaging in the swinging from no screens to all the screens. Minute to minute, hour to hour. So we're seeing that, again, you are not alone. Some of us are reflecting, right, that in general, I tend towards sort of a screen-free mode of parenting, or in general, we tend to be a pretty digitally engaged family. My guess is, as I'm looking at your responses, is that the pandemic has shifted and mixed up a lot of that anyway. And so even if we sort of have a philosophy, the reality is right now is that a lot of our screen time decisions are really complicated. And that's okay because it's actually backed up by the research that screen time decisions are fairly nuanced. And so the choices we make about technology and screens really doesn't just depend upon the app or the platform. It depends upon our kids. How are they doing? How are they doing offline? How are they doing online? Their temperament, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. It depends upon what's going on in terms of our health and our jobs, our energy, the different choices that we're making, whether we have support in the house to help or not, whether our kids are in daycare or not. And so blanket screen time rules are really tricky right now. They're tricky for us to follow through on. So rather than having the goal of our session being, okay, let's hear from an expert to craft our perfect digital life, many of you we might start to see participation kind of drop as people log off. Instead, we want to ground it in a pandemic sensitive, a pandemic adjusted goal, is that we want to do the very best that we can right now to keep young children learning, to keep them safe and healthy, and to keep them connected during this time. And so the goal is less about, do we allow screen time or do we not? But we start to ask, is this specific digital tool, is this specific online activity or digital resource, is that helping my child continue to learn? Is it keeping them safe? Is it keeping them healthy? And how are we staying connected? Is it helping or is it getting in the way? And it's certainly useful for us to keep an eye on this. We want to continue to ask this question and revisit it because, as I said in the beginning, right, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so this isn't a 6-week pandemic where we are just anything goes, it doesn't really matter. Child development doesn't stop. It didn't stop last February, and we're not out of the woods yet. And so what we know is that as children are growing and developing, that their experiences, their practice, the activities that we're doing shape their development. So at Spark and Stitch, we talk about that as whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. And if you've heard either my dad or I present before, you've heard this statement. This is not your first introduction. We talk about this in that way because our little kids get it, teenagers get it, parents get it, elders get it, that the brain is like a muscle, right? The more we exercise it, the more that we practice it, the better that it gets at that thing, whether that is imagination, creativity, impulse control, mathematics, right? Piano, whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. And so we're going to take a developmental lens to this conversation. We're not going to walk through individual apps, though you're welcome to ask questions at the end that are more specific to challenges in your home. But instead, let's remind ourselves that even though our whole world has changed in some really dramatic ways, what children need to thrive has not changed. And so let's ground our conversation about screens, not in the technology itself, but in our kids. Let's ground it in the core ingredients for healthy development that we knew about before the pandemic, are true now, and will continue to be true after. And what I want to do is walk through these different ingredients because they can be a helpful kind of framework for us as we start to make screen time, not just choices, but this is a pandemic, this is rough, screen time trade-offs. We're making a complicated, sometimes there are no best answers. And so we're doing the best that we can. And so we can come back to this, right? Is this activity helping my child connect? Is it in the context of relationships? Does it embody the spirit of play? And where are the places where I can set routine and boundaries that matter most and that can work for my family? Okay, so this is the plan together, is that we're going to walk through some examples from the research of where we see technology helping and where we see it potentially getting in the way. And then we'll talk and take some questions, and Bob will help me keep an eye on the chat. So if you're ready to dive in, why don't you just give me a yes in the chat? Let's do this. Let's take a look at these 3 ingredients. This is kind of an ironic question to ask, or sort of an unhelpful question, because so far I haven't seen anybody say no. I'm kind of leading you on, but you know, one of the things that we know about kids that is also true about adults is that we learn best in the context of relationships. And so even our ability to interact here helps you engage, and it helps me engage, right? Our kids are more likely to learn and feel brave when they can see that interaction. And we're doing the same thing here together today. So let's start with connection. We could do a whole, I know we only have an hour together over the lunch hour today, and we could spend a day just talking about the power of connection, especially for young children. And so this is one that we want to pay really close attention to. And we have example after example in the field of looking at screen time and child development, that often the thing that sort of tips screen use from either helpful or neutral to unhelpful or producing negative outcomes is whether or not it's enhancing or replacing connection in terms of the patterns, right? So over time, you know, in the course of our week, is screen use getting in the way of our sort of warm and responsive interactions, or is it helping, or is it just neutral, right? You watch TV, I have to get dinner made. It's not getting in the way. It's not necessarily helping. It's sort of neutral, unless that becomes the only way that we get through the day, right? So let me give you a quick example to show you just how powerful connection is and how easy it is to misinterpret or misread the lesson emerging from screen time research. And we have to make sure that we're paying attention to what really matters when it comes to child development. So we've known for a long time, it's probably no surprise to any of you that learning to read is an intensely social process, right? So we have not reached a time where we can plug children in and they learn how to read. They learn through talking. They learn through us reading to them. They learn through this interactive conversation that we have around books and around just objects in our environment and our experiences. So that's not new. So then the question became, and is especially relevant now as it's more difficult to get to libraries, or more, you know, school media centers are shut down. You know, what about ebooks? How does that shift children's literacy development, for example, right? And so researchers have looked at this, and what they've done is they've sort of taken groups of adults, and they've given half the adults a tablet, and they sit down with their child, their sort of preschool age child, and then they give half the adults the same story in a paper book, and then they read all the grown-ups read to the children, and then the researchers came back to the children and they asked them about their reading comprehension. Things like, who are the main characters, right? So it turned out that all the children were able to identify the fancy word for it is sort of surface story structure. So the sort of, you know, setting, characters, so that's good. The differences really showed up when the researchers started asking the kids about deep story structure. So things like, what was the moral of the story? What did the character learn? Or asking them to bridge their learning to their own life. Children read from a paper book, did really well on those questions, and children read on a tablet. In these studies, these initial studies did very poorly. So immediately that sort of first pass was, you know, lots of the popular press ran headlines that said, you know, ebooks destroy children's literacy. And the researchers were like, wait, hold on. Let's look closer at what happened here and read the sort of substantive research that followed in these papers, which was really that here are how if you look at the videos of the interactions, right? So parent is sitting with a child with a paper book and they're engaged in warm, interactive conversation, right? So they're reading this story and they're saying, oh, you have a dog. What's your dog's name? What does a dog say? You know, or with little older children even, you know, have you ever felt that way at school? So they're having this sort of warm, caring, interactive reading session. And then you look at the videos of the parents reading to their children on tablets, and the parents are not necessarily having the same kind of interactions. Here's the kind of things that they're saying to their kids. They're saying, okay, swipe it here, press harder. No, don't break it. Swipe it, press here. Okay, the dog is going bark, make the dog bark, right? So they've forgotten that they're reading a book to a child. And what's gotten in the way is really sort of instructive and directive and almost interactions that almost feel a little tense. And so of course the child doesn't remember anything about the deep story structure. They were too stressed trying to figure out how to operate the device and navigate the story with their parent. And so here's what the researchers did is they handed the parents a device that had a good child safe cover. And they just trained for a couple minutes and said, just enjoy the story, enjoy your child, get lost in the story with them. And they redid the experiments and all the differences went away. It really had nothing to do with where the story was hosted and everything to do with the conversation and interactions between parent and child. And we see that over and over and over again. When technology disrupts interaction, children tend to do worse. When it enhances or is neutral, then kids tend to do okay. This is sort of kids in the preschool above 2 years of age. And so the takeaway from this is really looking at, you know, what are the patterns of interaction in our house? And when we're choosing technology, the more simple the better. And so this is a great question from Leah. How does reading rainbow fit in, right? So I sort of had a hook of the original research, but now that you've heard the whole experience, the whole experiment, you can probably guess, right? That listening to LeVar and having that sort of warm and slow interaction, even on a screen for older preschool children, right? They can get a lot out of that story. So the more simple, the better. Enjoy the story, enjoy your child. And look for interactivity, and this is a little technical, on the plot line. So I like to think of it as, has this app turned a book into a video game, or is it still a book, right? So it becomes a video game where, having nothing to do with the story, I can touch the barn in the back and a chicken flies out, right? But it turns out that that's not a character in the story and it doesn't really matter. It's not that that's bad for kids, but it's not going to help them with reading and with understanding story and language. Does that make sense? So interactivity along the plot line, where it's about the main characters and what happened, minimal amount of that is fine. But mostly what we want to look for, and these books are much more accessible right now. If we can't go to the library, what a great time to be able to get simple ebooks in the hands of our kids. The more boring the actual interface is in some ways, if we are actually actively reading to them sometimes, the better. Okay, so simple is better. Try to avoid a lot of distracting bells and whistles. So we see, again, we could spend hours together and we're not going to, but just to remind us that just human beings really matter to young children. They just do. That doesn't mean children can't learn and engage and create with screens, but it has a lot more impact when adults are either there to facilitate it or to help them debrief it or to build a bridge to an offline activity after they're done, right? So they can make meaning of it. And so, for example, we have known for a while that all of it's not 100% understood, and there's a lot more research to do. But we know that for children under 2, for example, under 2.5 really, it's really hard for children to learn from screens and then transfer that to the real world. So, and don't worry, we won't just be talking about experiments this whole time. But, you know, under 2 or under 2.5, if, you know, you can have a child actually look at, research has been done where children are watching a video of the room right next to them, and an adult goes in and hides a toy in that room, and they're watching a video of it. And then they walk the children over to the room and they say, okay, find the toy. And they cannot find it. It's as if what they just saw in the video has no bearing on what's happening in real life. Now, children who look through a clear window at an adult walking into that room and hiding, the stuffed animal can walk into the room, and most of them can immediately find the stuffed animal. So just because children are learning on screens doesn't mean they can transfer it. The more that adults help them, the better. And older preschoolers get better at this. So they're able to sort of have that symbolism to look at what's happening on a screen, look at their home, and actually think, oh, what I just learned there is related to what's happening over here. So the more that we can sort of connect, the better. Now we're going to do real talk because all of us are in a different, we have a different competing sets of responsibilities. Some of us are trying to work at the same time that we're trying to parent, at the same time we're trying to teach. There is a lot going on. So the idea that we can be side by side with our young children at every moment isn't necessarily realistic. So we can look, I like to think of brain development too in terms of patterns, right? So whatever the brain does a lot of is what the brain gets good at. If you have 1 or 2 practice sessions here, they're not here or there, they're not going to have a huge impact. So we want to just look at, is technology sort of consistently replacing interaction, or is it enhancing it? And what could we be doing instead? What's the alternative to that activity? So if the alternative is that we're sorting laundry and we're having a conversation as we go, that's probably better than a color sorting app while I do the laundry, right? If the alternative is you're going to be unsupervised, we have older kids in Google Meets, I'm working and the other person is working in a hospital and out of the house, then the alternative is not warm and caring interaction. The alternative might be not super safe. And so in that case, maybe watching a great show is a great alternative or a doable alternative. Does that make sense? Right? So let's put it through that lens of sort of, is it consistently replacing interaction or enhancing it? And what could we be doing instead? Okay, so connection, number one, the more that we connect with kids about what they're seeing, what they're doing, the better. Children under 18 months of age don't learn much from screens really at all. So as kids get older, they are able to do more of that with adult support. Okay, so find ways to interact, even if it's once I'm done with my call, you watch this Daniel Tiger show, and then I can't wait for you to tell me all about it, right? Or maybe you have to watch 3 Daniel Tiger shows, and then I can't wait for you to tell me all about it, right? And so you're sort of engaging them in conversation about what they had just done. So children learn through relationship, and children learn through play. And this is no surprise for Minnesota Children's Museum members, if that's you. This is no surprise for anyone who spent 20 minutes with a 4 or 5-year-old. And what's really clear is that even though play is often talked about in the words of the beloved Mr. Rogers, as if it is a relief from serious learning, for children, play is serious learning. Sort of, it is the work of early childhood. And so all of the activities that children are doing in their environment, hands-on, using their senses, right? Not only does it look fun, but it's practicing all kinds of critical skills that they will need for learning. So even if they're not practicing their letters, right? As they engage in role play, they're doing perspective taking and they're learning about impulse control, right? The how we learn is built in early childhood, and that is built primarily through play. And so I would love for you to go into the chat and just think for a moment about some of your kids' favorite things that they play with, the things that have engrossed them in imaginative and creative play. And then just describe some of the things about them or list what they are. So yeah, Legos is a great example. So not the toys that sort of go to the corner after a while, but children can engage with them over time. Yeah, so lots of Legos. Yes, I have a Lego car with me here right now. My son put it here when he heard I was doing a children's museum. workshop. Cars, Magna-Tiles, right? Play-Doh, balls. So all of these have, dress up clothes, figures, drawing, coloring, so crafting supplies, cardboard boxes, kinetic sand. This sounds like a children's dream if we could just all sort of get in the same place and share these once the vaccine is through the population. So nature, outdoors. So these things all have some things in common, right? Children learn with hands-on. So whether we're talking about Kate's bringing her kids outdoors and they're touching things and they're getting muddy and messy and experimenting, sofa cushions, Leah, right? Where 1 minute it's an airplane and the next it's it's a fort, and we're switching their objects that the children can bring a lot of their ideas, a lot of their imagination, and they can learn with sort of hands-on, minds-on, feelings on. And so oftentimes when we talk about play, we think of it as play happens offline. And if we are committed to play, then we must have no screen time. And I actually want to problematize that for a little bit, and offer that play can be a framework with which we approach screen time as well. So there are some limitations to that. So the multi-sensory manipulation is really tough on screens. But during a pandemic where kids are just going to be spending more time on screens, I think that we can use some of these same some of the spirit of the toys that you just shared and approach our digital tools with some of that same philosophy so that our kids can get the most out of them. And so let me give you an example. As we look at, let me go back to that. As we look at a lot of the apps in the App Store are what we think of as interactive worksheets, right? So they are kind of the opposite of the toys that you just described that your children love playing with. They tend to be drag a color, name a letter. They're very focused on what we call cognitive skills, or letters, numbers, and colors. They make us grown-ups feel good. It's like, oh, kids are learning. They know their letters and numbers and colors. But they tend to be what we call drill and practice apps. So the App Store is full of these for young children. It's $1 billion industry. And the only thing that an app needs to do in order to be a part of the educational section of the App Store is to claim, my app is educational. That's all that's required. There's no sort of like child development panel that these apps go in front of. And so these don't tend to embody the spirit of play. Whereas there are other apps that we can think of that might embody the spirit of play a little more, right? So my son was doing, had an app where it was watching a little video about animal homes, and then, prompts him to go outside and find animal homes, right? Or to draw them, or to find them, if a mouse was gonna live in your house, where would it live? So they're bridging some of what's happening online to what might happen offline. And so I really love this quote from Lisa Guernsey, right? Ask not what is coming out of the iPad, but what is going into it. And so if your child can bring some of that creativity, open-ended play, this can be really useful for those same kind of executive function skills, or the skills that we just briefly touched on in terms of emotional regulation and impulse control, perspective taking, and creativity. Those open-ended apps that allow children to bring themselves to it can be really useful. So I'm seeing there's some, do you have specific apps? So yes, Minecraft is actually a great example for those of you who have those sort of early elementary kids, of sort of an expansive, open-ended world where kids can learn things, build things, and in some ways it's like a giant virtual Lego set. I'm glad you asked that question, Kelly, because this is often how we feel when we're heading into the App Store. The labels essentially mean nothing. They're in a different language. And how do I find something that's great for my kids? So for younger children, I do think that the PBS Kids apps are great. The PBS Kids shows in general, for our youngest children, sometimes the easiest thing we can do is just, here's the playground, have a blast in there. And there are, shows, the Molly of Denali app, and these sorts of things that can sort of bridge what they're watching with storytelling with some of the games that they that they might be playing. If you don't know about Common Sense Media, many of you likely do. This is a great resource for better understanding, what are some apps that might be good for my 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old, right? Kelly, this is a good question. Do you consider safety in these app recommendations as well? Yeah, so that's where I would look to things like Common Sense. So Minecraft is a great example. The activity itself is very creative and open-ended. The fact that you can engage in open play in other people's realms with strangers is probably not safe for younger children. And so we have to sort of think about how do we balance the play aspect with it while keeping it safe. So with young children, we like to think of digital spaces as we want to create a safe digital playground that's fairly constrained so that we can let them tinker and play inside of it. So avoiding games with lots of advertising, avoiding games where they can interact with children that they don't know or people that they don't know, right? We want those sort of off limits for our youngest kids. If you don't know about Tap, Click, Read, there's a book published a couple of years ago, but they have a number of app recommendation sites as well. Children's Technology Review is another great one that can help us sort of get a sense of what's appropriate and what might not be appropriate. Minecraft is, or Common Sense is nice because it'll give us some things, what to look out for. Here are the positives, here are the things to talk to our kids about. So for those of you who are here with elementary age children, the more that we can talk to them about what they might encounter in these spaces, the better. Okay, so we have 20 minutes left. We've talked a bit about connection, play, and I do want to talk briefly about boundaries before we get to some Q&A. Because really when we look at screen time in children, measuring just in terms of sheer time does matter because it guards against the extremes. We know way too much entertainment screen time is not great for kids. As kids get older, there is such thing as too little screen time as they head into adolescence. But for little kids, content really, really matters as well. And so during the pandemic, we have a couple different levers to push. So it could be that we have the lever available to us of time, because maybe we can say, you know what, I am home, I can sort of facilitate an activity with you, so we're going to stop this and we're going to move on to something that I can be with you. Now, others are juggling a lot of competing things. Maybe somebody in the house has COVID, right? There's all kinds of things happening. And so time is like a little bit away from me right now. So if there's a lot of time, let's make sure that we pull that lever of content. So age appropriate content that's made for kids really helps improve outcomes. It sounds obvious, but especially those of us with multiple kids, multiple ages, this becomes tricky. So I know that we said we'd answer questions at the end. I'll answer just a couple as we go, which might shorten our Q&A time at the end, but I think it's useful when they really resonate. So, this question, how do we navigate the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation to limit screen time to 2 hours when they have at least 2 hours of virtual school? Yeah, so let's review those broad recommendations again, knowing that time is only one piece of the puzzle, right? So your child and then the content that they're watching and when they're engaging with screens, right? If it's at night, right before bed, we'd see really different outcomes than during the day. So under 18 months, the American Academy of Pediatrics says to limit screen time, so that we don't see a lot of good or benefits coming out of screen time for kids under 18 months, with the exception of FaceTime and video chat. And so that can be useful in terms of really understanding. Sometimes it's not for the kid, it's for the grandpa or the grandma or the elder, right? And I think that's a very legit need right now during COVID. So, video chat away. After that, it's 1 hour of entertainment and media a day for preschool age children, and then 2 hours a day. So I think the question around virtual school is just to be really clear that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations are around entertainment media. So that's considered media and screen time that's not for school. So if your daycare is doing programming for an hour a day, that just is not technically considered part of that entertainment screen time diet, right? So if you have an elementary age kid and they're in school, all day online, right? They might still want to play video games with their friends after school for a limited amount of time, right? So that's to clarify, that's entertainment media. And even the American Academy of Pediatrics during the pandemic has said, you know, we want to be really sure that we are being gentle with ourselves and being flexible and watching for these other things. Are kids getting connection and relationships? Are they getting to play? Are they getting to explore their environment and be creative? And then, you know, here's where we talk about content. So let me just share a couple of things around content. The stories really matter. And so brand new study just came out, hot off the presses last week, about screen time for children 0 to 8. And for the first time, streaming YouTube videos and sort of streaming videos has overtaken traditional TV content for young children. So that's not inherently bad, except that YouTube was not created for children. It was created for adults. And so the content doesn't tend to be age appropriate. The algorithms serve up all kinds of videos that are not made for children, and it's very heavily influenced by advertising. So we want to be looking for content that will allow us to do this juggling act. For young children, honestly, through young elementary, PBS Kids is still a great go-to, right? So Odd Squad and things that are made for slightly older kids can still be really great. For little kids, right, instead of endlessly streaming YouTube, if there's specific people we can follow, right? So following the Cosmic Kids Yoga folks or the Art for Kids Hub. There's an alternative video service called The Kids Should See This. And it's just got great videos that are not concerning, right? And so this is a really useful, this is looking at these sort of alternatives or using YouTube Kids as a way to, how do we again create that little playground. As kids get older, we want to be talking to them about what they're doing and talking to them about where they're going. So with little kids, we can have more control. As they get older, we still want to, they might be doing and seeing more, but then the more that we can engage them in that conversation about the content, the better. Okay, so final, and then we'll take some questions, is one of the things that I think is useful, and this actually works all the way up for your middle schoolers, is, you know, really identifying, instead of just getting up every day and stressing about, are screens ruining my kid? It can be helpful to start with, what does my kid need to cope with stress, to get their healthy development, right? So we know that they need to play inside and outside, and that's not just for little kids, it's all the way up through adolescents and adults, right? We know that kids need to be able to manipulate objects in their environment. We know that they need connection, and they desperately need, it would probably be poorly attended, but we could do a whole workshop just on sleep, right? So they desperately need sleep. So if we can, and meal times, right? So if we can sort of protect some spaces as screen-free, that life is hard and full and has lots of trade-offs right now, but we're gonna make sure we just protect, we're gonna fiercely guard these spaces. So even if the rest of the day feels very hairy, right? Our kids will do better if we guard one space for high quality interaction than to sort of engage in what we call continuous partial attention all day long. So we're constantly multitasking. It'd be better to just do our sort of separate from them and then actually engage. So sometimes it can be helpful for us to just step back and say, how are we filling our bucket? Sort of how are we building our day? Knowing that inevitably it's not gonna look perfect. It's going to feel like it's crumbling. We have to keep adding different Legos in different places. There are pieces that never even make it into the plan, but we're attending more to what are these essential ingredients, and is screen time helping our kids engage with these things, or are they getting in the way of it? So let's take some, I know I answered some questions throughout, but let's, and Bob can help me answer a few questions before we wrap up. Specifically, I know that I saw a couple questions come in about screen time transitions, how to help kids get off screens. I do have some ideas around that, but Bob, if you see any coming in, you're welcome to shoot some my way. Let's see. You know, let me talk about screen time transitions, because I saw it come in a couple times early on when we were talking about boundaries. Okay, so Carrie agrees. I would love some support around transition. So this can be really tricky. There isn't, no presenter can come in and say, well, I figured it out. I just hand the kid an iPad, take it away. They say, thank you, please, and give you a parenting award. That doesn't generally happen. I do have one. I don't have a slide for every question, but I look at this fairly frequently as a parent myself. So a couple of things, just a couple of offerings and tools that might be useful. So transition tips. This is really hard during COVID, but the more predictable structure, the better, especially for young children. So if they know we always watch, shows in the morning before lunch, and then we watch shows maybe in the afternoon, or whatever your system is, it can be easier for us. So we're not constantly the ones arbitrating that, to sort of say, yep, well, this is our morning show time and we're going to do it now. So if we can, even if we have to change that week to week, we can at least say, well, this week, here's how we're going to do that. And then reminding them right before, right? So we're going to have a couple of shows. And then we are going, remember, after 2 shows, we're going to stop. So I do suggest doing it by show, not by time. So like PBS kids shows are like 22 minutes long. So if you say you can have a half hour of screen time, that's really, really tough to have a kid stop in the middle of a show. So we're going to watch 5 YouTube videos on YouTube Kids or on The Kids Should See This, and then we're going to wrap up. We get so stuck in minutes, like the American Academy of Pediatrics says 1 hour. So I think, and I love this. So Lisa says, the protocol of pause, breathe, finish up, really helpful. So that's what I would consider an ending ritual that you do every time you stop. This is not just for young children. This works for elementary kids as well. Your middle schoolers will not probably engage, but probably not a lot of parents of middle schoolers on this workshop. So ritual, right? So remember, when we're done with our 2 shows, we're going to pause, we're going to breathe, and we're going to wrap it up, right? And so maybe the ritual is that we count down from 5, and then we have a dance party. And then the only other, I think, tip that can be really useful, especially during COVID, is to try to make that transition. So screen time is a high reward activity. Like they're like, presumably they're having a blast. And so to have that transition go from that to nothing or to being ignored, it doesn't tend to go very well. So transition to another high reward activity, even if it's just a couple minutes, like a family dance party or an activity they love, like they love coloring with the specific set of art materials like that. Remember, then we're going to pause, breathe, stop, and we're going to move on to that. Being with them for the transition can be really useful, even if then we fade away back to work. So try it. Try high reward to high reward.
So Erin, we've got a couple around a little bit older kids, like 9 to 12-year-old, and I don't know if you have a time limit. Maybe it varies by child or varies by the content, like you've been saying, around what's actually happening, but specific really to video games in particular, like it's after school, right? The homework is wrapped up or whatever. Now it's time for the reward of video games for a 9 to 12-year-old.
Yeah.
And is there what does research say, and what do you say about the value of those video games where they are maybe interacting with other teens? Is there a time thing and the content, like the quality level? Is it pure entertainment, or is there some social positive with video games in particular?
Yeah. So that's this is again where I would say the similar frameworks that we've been talking about do translate. They do age up pretty well, even though the examples change a little bit. So again, the official recommendation, which is like way out of reach for some families right now, or maybe way under, or maybe you have way under, but it's about 2 hours a day of entertainment media. So now the question is, they're on school for 8 hours a day. So I would say, pay attention to are they filling their other buckets? So for older kids, it's like, are they moving their bodies in some way, right? Are they connecting with their friends? And are they sleeping? So sleep for older kids it's essential for all kids, but we have got to protect sleep, and tech and sleep aren't a good match. So when technology comes into the bedroom, we tend to sleep worse. Us adults do too. So in terms of gaming, so I would look at, are they filling their other buckets? If yes, great. So maybe that's, after school, sure. When you get outside and you move your body for a bit, then you can play video games. Because we also want to look for what's the replacement cost. So during COVID, it could be that, yes, ideally you'd go out and hang out with your friends, but you can't right now. And so gaming is where you're seeing your friends. So is it the ideal 2-hour activity? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe right now, because the alternative isn't there. So what we want to look for in gamers is, are they connecting with healthy friendships? That's a really great thing. Are they filling their other buckets? And if they are engaging in content as they get older and older that feels a bit gray area for you, is an adult talking to them about what they're doing in those online spaces and helping them problem solve. So I don't think what we want to say to like a 12-year-old is, well, you just spent time in online school. The only way to socialize with your friends is in gaming, but we're not doing it at all. I think it is time to flex a little bit and then pay attention to your kid, right? Is it working? If it's working, great. If it's not working, we might need to pivot.
And then a couple of questions on screen time, either as a reward, entertainment screen time, which I probably should say, as a reward or as a punishment or a disincentive. Do you have a point of view on pros and cons of taking away or rewarding with entertainment screen time?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's like the pure science answer, and then there's a reality of life answer. So I would say in terms of reward, what can be useful is to just pace out, sort of, again, think about the buckets that you want for your kids. And then if you find that once they play video games, you can't get them outside, then we can use that when then language that helps really, there is sort of a carrot at the end of that, but it's not, if you do this, then I will get you a video game, right? This is sort of it's more where we fall into bribing, but I don't think that we need to shy away from rewards. Rewards are not a bad thing for kids, especially during times of stress, where there aren't a lot of natural rewards, right? They don't get the reward of running across the field with the soccer team. They don't get the reward of rolling around on the carpet in their daycare, maybe, depending on what's going on. So we have to think about what are those highlights. So maybe it's when we play outside, then we're gonna then we get to watch a show, right? And so I think that sometimes that will help. When we finish our chores, then you have free time. And if you choose to watch your 2 shows during that free time, go for it. Awesome. Can't wait to see that, right? So it's a little bit of a shift in how we're thinking, but try it. Bob, I'm trying to remember if that was not your full. Oh, and then what about taking it away? So in general, consequences that are related to the rule make they cause the most learning for our kids. So if the issue is around screen time, right? That, the YouTube, I don't want to be done with YouTube videos because the algorithms are like serving up unboxing videos in like perpetuity. And so when I'm done, I'm 6 and I'm slamming the tablet against the wall and I'm hitting my little brother, right? Then we say, well, remember, if you choose to hurt someone or hurt me at the end of this show, then you're choosing no show tomorrow, right? And we'll practice. And then we have to actually follow through and not doing it. So if we're constantly using screen time to unrelated things, like you hit your brother, you don't get your screen time. You do this, you don't get your screen time. It tends to put a lot of power around screen time. So the more that we can step back and we can think about, is there a consequence that's actually related to this thing? So if it's around dinner, then maybe, you're the one who cleans up all the dishes, right? So trying really hard to get specific to that activity and not making it the go-to always screen time, because we're going to need it. It's a powerful one. Reserve it for where it's going to have a little more efficacy. So
great. Well, we're at the little bit less than 2-minute warning. So I don't know if you had a concluding remark, and then I'll just kind of give us a quick wrap.
Great. I think here's the one of the comforting things from the research is that we certainly know what kids need to thrive. And so I think the more that we can focus on, are we doing the best we can with what we have available right now to sort of help our kids engage in these activities, and giving ourselves permission when screens are helping us creatively meet those needs. Let's enjoy it. Enjoy our child, enjoy the activities. And if that's on a screen, we don't want that to immediately to immediately clamp it down. So even though we might like really clear rules and clear routines, this is a mess of a time. And the reality is that kids who feel sort of safe and secure and have adults around them who say, we are in this together, we're a team, and we're doing the best we can, that's the most protective thing that we can do for our kids right now. And doing it online, offline, and everything in between is part of what's going to help us all get through this. So I hope that this was useful as we think about investing in those ingredients rather than focusing too much on what not to do.
Right, I'm typing a note. Huge thanks. So Erin, thank you so much. Really great. I just thought there were some really great nuggets. Somebody asked if we're going to post this, the video. I'm going to try to. We're going to get that worked out. A couple last minute housekeeping things. Look for a survey link and a wrap-up link that we'll send via email to the participants. You can tell us what you thought. There'll be a donation link if you want to donate to the museum. And there'll be maybe some other info about learning more about Erin and Spark and Stitch. And also a reminder, we are going to have 2 more seminars, one in January, one in February, different topics. You'll see some signups for those as well. So thank you, everybody. We miss everyone. We miss our members. We miss our other visitors. The museum currently closed, but we hope to be opening sometime after the holidays and really welcoming everybody back when we can safely. So again, thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thanks, everybody. Take care of yourself. Stay safe, stay connected.